Faye, are you trying to say something? You'll have to unmute your. Our guest speaker today is Nicolas Moyer. Nicolas is with the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, which is Canada's only national umbrella organization for Canadian civil society organizations involved in international development. Their members represent a broad range of humanitarian and developmental organizations, including faith-based and secular groups, labor unions, cooperatives, and professional associations. The CCIC seeks to end global poverty and to promote social justice and human dignity for all. Nicolas is an experienced nonprofit leader and highly motivated social entrepreneur, known for building bridges between diverse stakeholders and delivering innovative approaches to strengthen the impact of nonprofit organizations. He states that strategy, leadership, marketing, and communications are his strengths, and that data, innovation, and quality processes are his tools. He has a BA in economics from the Université de Montréal. He has an MA in international relations from the, I believe it's the Macquarie University in Australia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly. And he also has an MBA from Queen's. He's founded and led organizations. He's launched dozens of national multi-platform fundraising and communications campaigns, and has raised tens of millions of dollars to assist survivors of humanitarian disasters. He's proud to have received Ottawa's 2016 40 Under 40 Award from the United Business Journal. So not only is it good to have somebody here that's under 40, but I'm delighted to ask Nicolas to take the floor and tell us what you're all about. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to join you all today. Thank you for that introduction. And I wish I was still under 40, but I passed that milestone just recently. So, and I seem to have more gray in my beard than I did when I got that award from the Ottawa Business Journal. It really is a pleasure to speak to you all. And I also want to add my congratulations to Hammam. Really wonderful to see your membership growing and to hear also to get a glimpse of some of the projects that you're all working on together.
Thank you.
So, you know, as was just said, I will give you a bit of an introduction, though, about our organization, and probably first of all to point out that actually we changed our name in October. So over my head there, you'll see that actually we're called Cooperation Canada now, and so our website is cooperation.ca. But we are a long-standing association. We've been around for over 50 years, almost all of that under the name of the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, or CCIC. We're, loosely speaking, we're the sector association for international development and humanitarian organizations. And so much as you might imagine, you know, Canadian dairy farmers represents dairy farmers, we represent the interests of what are actually over 2,000 organizations that are registered in Canada that have some kind of international mandate. And so it's a really privileged role that I have and that our organization has to work with these organizations and to represent their collective interest. It's a very diverse sector. It's some of those you would know well. The Red Crosses would probably come to mind, or Oxfam, or Plan, or CARE are a member of ours. But actually, it's a very diverse sector from coast to coast across the country. There are organizations, large and small, that work towards contributing to global progress. And those projects can take the form of building a school and contributing to education, or others focus on food security or on health, on vaccinations, on income generation projects and support. It is a very big sector, and many people don't realize how significant it is in Canada. Collectively, those 2,000 organizations employ over 14,000 Canadians. They mobilize over $5 billion a year to contribute to social progress around the world, and I think it's worth stating that. Our role as a national association is to do a lot of work around best practice, convening the sector. So we do a lot of that on thematics, bringing sort of communities of practice together, elevating best practice as organizations in the spheres of international cooperation and development. We do research and analysis also at a level sort of that is cross-cutting across our membership's interests and themes, and looking at Canadian government policy. And then finally, we do a lot of focus on building relationships and influencing policy with the Canadian government. Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, the single biggest actor in Canada with respect to contributing to global progress is our government. And I'll speak to you a bit about that today. And I'm certainly happy to speak more about our organization. We're not large. There's 15 staff at our organization, and we're independent from government because our members pay for us to exist. And that's really important because we need to be able to speak the truth to our government that doesn't always do things the way we would believe that they should be done. And so I wanted to take a few moments that I have with you today to talk about where we are as a planet as we deal with the COVID-19 crisis. I think we've all been living this at home, and we've been following the news and all the challenges that we've all individually had in our families and our circles of colleagues and acquaintances as we've been going through this. It's been a really difficult crisis for us, and it's really elevated inequalities in our own country. But at the same time, we are among the very privileged in the world because we have a country that allows us to invest in safeguards and conceivably purchase vaccines for Canadians. And we're able to put in place protections for each other, however imperfect they may be. The fact is, though, that actually this crisis had huge impacts right across the globe and across all borders. I think more than ever, we're seeing how interconnected we are as a planet and as humankind. One of the things that has really struggled for me and for many in our sector is, how inward focused this has turned us as a country, and is happening in jurisdictions right across the world. As we protect ourselves and each other, we haven't been looking at what's happening elsewhere. And so I want to take a moment to share with you some of that. Because one of the things that our sector does a lot, by our sector, international development and humanitarian organizations, we focus a lot on the problems. And there are a lot of problems. There are inequalities and injustices throughout the globe. But there's actually behind us about 3 decades of consistent, systematic progress as humankind. Greater access to education, greater access to vaccines, greater access to clean water, better income levels, lower levels of extreme poverty across the globe. This has been a consistent progress over recent decades. And yet last year, suddenly it all stopped. And in fact, we're now looking at what is probably a regression de-development like we haven't seen in a generation. And I want to speak a little bit to that because the impacts have been very clear that this crisis has really exacerbated inequalities all across the globe. And first and foremost for women, it's a very gendered crisis. Women tend to be in the social sectors, to be on the front lines in responding to the COVID crisis, in addition to playing their critical roles within their homes and actually having to protect and take care of those around them. And so we've seen that consistently right across the planet. And so it is a she session, it's a she crisis in many respects. But we've also seen this inequality being exacerbated all over. Income inequality has been part of defining what vulnerability is. Those that have more access to resources have been able to protect themselves better and their families than others have been able to. And when I talk about de-development, let me just give you an idea of what this actually, how it's playing out. So think about vaccine rollout campaigns, whether they're for polio or other things, and I know the role of your club in supporting polio campaigns. Basically, vaccine rollouts have stopped in many parts of the world. There's been a real rollback in the ability for these campaigns to actually continue. And we know the importance of that. We've seen malnutrition rates climb as supply chains have been disrupted, as economies have been disrupted. We've seen access to education decline in really important ways as schools have closed. And I think it's important for me to remind everyone that actually there are 25% of schools on this planet that don't have access to running water. And how do you deal with hygiene concerns around COVID if you don't have access to running water? I think that's a really big concern, access to education, and where schools in other countries don't have access to virtual learning opportunities that we might be able to do and offer our children in Canada. I also wanted to make a point to speak to economies and how these really are, in many respects, in tatters. So whether they're economies that were dependent on tourism, or economies that were part of global supply chains that have been disrupted or slowed down. Simultaneously to these disruptions, remittances have gone down because a lot of people stopped working that were sending remittances back home. It's a sort of multiple impacts on economies and right across the globe. And it has led to risks of debt crises. And I won't go there too much, but there's really a big challenge for us as global economies interconnected, when many of the most vulnerable countries on the planet are now facing scenarios where a few now are paying more on their debt servicing than they are on their healthcare systems. And I don't think it needs reminding that in the context of COVID, our global health systems are only as strong as our weakest links. One point I did really also want to underscore was human rights. And this crisis has really seen authoritarian states. And I could speak to examples, and I hope that our question period might go there. But there have been multiple examples across the globe of COVID health measures being used to dampen civil societies, voices, critiques of government. And governments have been taking a much heavier hand in many places around the globe and being allowed to do this. As we have seen democracy sort of in decline and being challenged right across the globe. I think one of the most recent and most obvious examples that has shown up in our media has been in Myanmar, where the military junta has taken power again. But you can find examples of this in many countries around the globe. And when we see this, it really begs the question, how are we dealing with this moment collectively as humankind? Because we can protect each other, but we're all interconnected. And this is raising a lot of really big and important questions for organizations like those that we represent, that are civil society organizations that are on the front lines, delivering services to protect people, contributing to social progress, and who have a specific role also to hold governments to account and to challenge them to do the right thing, to do better on human rights, to do better on access to education or on gender equality, and that are being specifically targeted in this context today. And I wanted to mention all of this without trying to present a super glum perspective, although frankly, there are really, really concerning trends happening right around the globe, because we actually should be thinking about what our role in this is as a country in Canada, because we have benefited tremendously in recent decades from the outcomes of the Second World War and the multilateral order that we built, the Bretton Woods agreements, the expansion of the UN and free trade infrastructure, to name a few. And we've benefited a lot from that. And here, for the first time in a whole generation, we're facing a truly global crisis. I don't think it needs mentioning, but it's worth it anyway, that we won't be safe just on the vaccine side and on COVID variants until we've been able to deal with this everywhere. We won't end COVID at home until we've ended it everywhere. We are already seeing more variants spinning out. And that means that we could find ourselves, even if we're all vaccinated for one strain of COVID, it could be that next year we're dealing with another and we're all under lockdown again. So never our own interest in Canada has been more tied to global progress. And look at what is happening to us, and what does that then beg as a question for how we should be investing in global progress. And so I'm going to wrap up just talking about some of the advocacy that we've been doing with the Canadian government. We realize that we're a very diverse sector. We've got great ambitions for what Canada can and should do in the world. And Canada is a really strong, positive contributor to global progress. We have contributed to and support Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, which prioritizes women and girls in international development. But we've also realized that our country has been far from doing its fair share for a long time. In fact, even before the COVID crisis, our country was not contributing its fair share. Now, some of you may be familiar, but there's been a long-standing agreement among wealthier nations that we should be contributing 0.7% tiny little amount, of our gross national income towards development assistance. This is a benchmark that was set in the Lester B. Pearson era. And some countries have met this. The UK has legislated it. Norway and Denmark and Ireland and Germany have met those targets. We have not. And in fact, we're at our lowest level as a percentage of GNI in 50 years. And many people don't realize that. We're actually, our high watermark was under a Mulroney government. And so while we've had an internationalist lens in a lot of our discussions as a nation, wanting to contribute to progress, we haven't actually been walking the talk of investing in that. We're actually behind our OECD peers. We're below average, and we're at our lowest point in 50 years. And that really begs the question, why is that? When we poll Canadians, we find out that consistently 75 to 80% believe that we should be doing our fair share or leading in global development and investments in these spaces. Of course, Canadians don't prioritize it over healthcare or other things. Governments consistently that have been elected, whether liberal or conservative at the federal level, have not prioritized international engagement over domestic. And it does require a strategic perspective on things. And so we've worked a lot as a sector to make the moral and ethical case for why we should be investing in these things. But we've also decided now to look further, because there are actually clear, enlightened self-interest arguments, you could call them, strategic investment arguments, you could call them, for why we should be investing in development assistance globally. So we've launched something called the Together Project, and it's really the outcome of a lot of work between actors within our sector. And I'm going to share this in the chat now. If any of you are interested, it basically lays out the case for investing in development assistance. And it does so across multiple spheres. It raises important questions about this being framed as an investment and not just the right thing to do. It just so happens the right thing to do is also the strategic thing to do, that our country benefits when the world does well. We do well when the world does well. And that's true if you look at a trade example. I could tease this out as an example in the Together Project. Canada was invested in the war in South Korea, and following that, invested in development assistance in that country. It's now the 11th largest economy in the world, and we trade over $6 billion with them a year, have a free trade agreement with that country. We benefit a lot more from that trade relationship than we ever gave in development assistance. The same could be said of Vietnam. The same could be said of Bangladesh as it evolves as well. And there are a lot of other examples like that. And so it's in our strategic interest to be investing in these spaces. If we don't, are we going to be ceding the future in this crisis moment to countries like China or Russia, who are deploying vaccines and offering assistance to other countries as we don't? Democracies are under threat, human rights are under threat. Canada has a role to play, and we really should be playing that role. So over the last little while, our association has been really engaging with parliamentarians around this. You may or may not be familiar, but in the last political sort of federal election, the Conservative Party proposed that we cut development assistance. And while that might be a good soundbite in an election, it truly is short-sighted, because it's in our interest for the world to do well. And in fact, you know, it's interesting, but on the international side, it's not just development actors that are saying we should do more. Those who are interested in our diplomatic affairs would say the same. Those that are interested in our security interests would say the same. We've been underinvesting in all of our foreign relationships for decades. I'll give you one example of the African continent. Demographics don't lie. The African continent is where all the growth of this century is going to be. And the fastest growing economies have been on that continent for the last decade. And that, it just so happens, we've actually closed 4 diplomatic missions on that continent instead of opening new ones. We're being short-sighted in our engagement internationally, and it's time to step up our game. And so we're working with others to get that case across. And just last week, we met with 60 parliamentarians to make that case, and the resonance is strong. And actually the feedback's been very good. But we're really now in a stage where we need to try to engage our government to really commit and to make those contributions that we think are necessary. I'll probably just end now by sharing the specific ask that we've been providing to government, and I will in a moment put it in the chat as well. But it is basically to put this in context. We are asking the Canadian government to invest just 1% of our COVID response in Canada to the global response. We believe that 99% of our domestic resources should fairly be targeted to Canadians and keeping them safe. But we also think that it's entirely appropriate that we be spending 1% to address recovery worldwide, that we have an interest in doing that. And so I'll share the case that we've been providing to parliamentarians, the Prime Minister's office, and elsewhere, and certainly would love your reactions to that. I think I will be stopping there as I hopefully have triggered some thoughts for all of you about what Canada's role is in the world, how we could be advocating for us to be doing more. And it's really not one or the other. It's not us or others. It's us with others. And so hopefully some of that resonates with you, and then we can see if there are questions and where that takes us.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Much appreciated. There's been a couple of comments coming in here. I'm going to just start with one that I just sent in, actually. Is it fair to say that most political parties figure that spending on international development and even, I suppose, spending more money on NATO and you know, putting our fair share in there isn't going to buy any more votes in Canada? They're better to offer the money as a prize for Canadians instead of internationally?
I think that is one way of putting it, and I would say that that's not only true of international development. I think that's true of all international affairs. Pretty consistently, I think we've seen that our political parties at the federal level don't speak much to foreign affairs. If you look at party platforms, they give it very little space and tend to focus on sound bites. And this is a difficult reality for those who are interested in evolutions around the globe, and from any lens, whether that's a security lens, a trade lens, an immigration lens, or a development lens. We really do struggle with this because a lot of our foreign policy seems to be driven towards a national audience and actually requires, unfortunately, much longer term thinking than what is possible through our electoral cycles. And so it's why we're seeing that other countries that are less democratic are more effective in their ability to drive their foreign agendas. And I think that's something we have to wrestle with, really, quite honestly. The big moves of our foreign policy historically as a country were not based on public opinion. They were based on strategic analysis, enlightened awareness by political decision makers, sorry. And so I think you are right, and it's something that we struggle with. So we have to be able to make a case to parliamentarians who turn back and tell us, well, where's the public support for it? And we'll show them the polling. But Canadians, and naturally so, when it comes to electing a government, we'll be talking about the issues that most directly affect them. And so foreign issues don't elevate to the top of the pile there.
Is it fair to say that we're sitting here saving money while China is buying Africa?
I certainly think there's truth to that statement. I would say that so if we look globally right now, the democracies don't have wind in their sails. Quite the opposite. In fact, countries that were piloting, testing democratic exercises are finding that they are doing better elsewhere and with other kinds of partners. Democracies have stopped in big investments in infrastructure projects, for example, as we once did. And China is filling in the void. But they're not alone. Turkey is taking an approach like this as well. And realistically, if we want the world of the future to be one of human rights, to be one of equality, to be one of equal trading nations, of progress that's inclusive for everyone, the reality is we're going to need to invest in that. We can't assume it's going to happen. It won't. There are many forces that are working in the other direction and clearly and quite blatantly putting their self-interest forward, and that includes China.
Yeah, they're starting to come in here. I'm just going to run down. Here's Canadians are generous people. How do we get this message to the public that our government are not doing their part? Do we need some kind of a history lesson?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question. We've been really wrestling with that because Canadians, all of us, we like to be proud. We like to talk about ourselves as leaders. We're, lead the world on X, Y, and Z. But if you talk to our partners around the globe, all of them will tell us that we sound pretty preachy. that actually we say all these right things, but we don't really walk the talk. We're not there as partners to invest. And so there's this dissonance between our public messaging, whether it's the Prime Minister, coming to office and saying we're back, or whether it's the average Canadian that consistently overestimates how much we provide. We've done a lot of polling, and in this, we've discovered that Canadians actually average in their estimates of what they think we give as development assistance. They think it's close to 10% of our federal budget, which is just astronomical in terms of size. It's a dramatic overestimation of how much we give. And so, yes, there is a history lesson that maybe needs to be provided there, but who wants to be the one that stands up and says how poor we are in terms of our performance? And so we're trying to figure out how we can do that. Maybe we do need a sort of kick in the pants to get us back on track and realize that actually we're not performing as we should. I think that there is, however, a little bit of awakening that's happening around this. And I'd say that our rankings on the COVID response, for example, or the decision by the federal government to withdraw vaccines from the COVAX facility. For any of you that have followed this, this was the global facility meant to provide equitable access to vaccines for developing countries. We've chosen to withdraw and sort of jump to the front of the queue for ourselves. I think these are reminders to Canadians that, hey, wait a second, we've got a role to play. Our global brand has taken a few hits recently, whether that's our inability to resolve the question of the 2 Michaels that are stuck in China, our ranking with respect to vaccines. So we'll have to build on that narrative. I just don't have a silver bullet. Oh, you're on mute.
I figured nobody wanted to hear me anymore. This one's coming from Glenn. Not having yet read the investment case, is there any evidence, you kind of touched on this, is there any evidence that increased involvement in foreign development has a payback? Or is the justification for involvement internationally a moral and justice one or an economic one?
Well, it's a good question, Glenn. It really is. Actually, there's a lot of evidence of the impact of development assistance on human progress indicators. So whether that's education, access to vaccines, health indicators, income, and really that first mile of getting communities and economy to a place where sort of market economies can then trigger in, that the infrastructure is in place, that the education levels are there. What we are starting to build with the Together project is the case for the return on investment for Canada, that actually we benefit from this. And so the lines of, there are many, so there's no single consolidation of all of this, but what I'll give you is a few good examples. Canada doesn't send many peacekeepers overseas anymore. It's expensive for us. A soldier on average costs $1,000 a day to deploy, and that's before really heavy security environments. We don't send many peacekeepers anymore. But you know who does? Bangladesh and Rwanda, major recipients of our aid. So they actually fill in the void for us. We don't have to expend Canadian lives or security investments in the way that we once did in terms of our deployments. That's one way that we can look at this. Another is on the trade returns. And so I gave this the South Korea example. And I could turn to Bangladesh and I could turn to Vietnam. We trade more with those, particularly with Vietnam, we trade more with them now in any year than we ever gave them in development assistance. And that's before you start talking about the soft benefits. So when you think about our relationships with African countries, having a mission there, contributing to development objectives, contributing to the success of their healthcare systems, for example, buys us good credit, buys us partnership, buys us friends. And those friends can help us in the Security Council bid, for example, which is a hard thing for us to quantify. So admittedly, there are a lot of softer elements to this. We find it an uncomfortable argument to be having to make as civil society organizations, because profoundly the moral and ethical reason should be enough. And I think that actually it is for most people. But we do need to be able to demonstrate to those wearing suspenders in Finance Canada that are making those choices. I'm not sure they all wear suspenders, but they certainly all care a lot about the balance sheets. And they do need to see what that return on investment is. So we're working towards being able to demonstrate that more clearly. I also think it should be our government's role to demonstrate that clearly for itself as well.
So I don't know if I could speak up. I had asked a question fairly early on, and I'll just prerequisite. I'm an international development practitioner. I actually work for an NGO based in the States, but I'm a recent permanent resident here to Canada. So I'm trying to get up to speed a little bit more with Canada's role in the international development sphere. But my question was earlier on, sort of about sort of the higher level role of Canada or Canadian organizations in the sort of the global environment of international development, because I would imagine, you know, even if it's a percentage of the budget, you know, obviously the US's involvement is disproportionately higher because of the relevant proportion of the budget. And so my question was sort of about what is Canada's role in terms of areas of focus, because I would imagine it would have to be a lot more nuanced or targeted because there isn't that same level of scope. And then, you know, to try and get an idea of how, because I did study at McGill, and then over the years between the Harper government and the more recent Liberal government, that the changes of how government changes impact that level of investment or the role that would take.
Mm-hmm. No, I think so. Thanks for the question. And obviously, there are unique characteristics to the international cooperation space in Canada, and one could compare it to the US. Obviously, we're smaller, but also there are different dynamics here at play. If I could summarize your question, it sounds a little bit like, what is our comparative advantage? What does our sector do from here that is different from elsewhere? I think one of the really salient Canadian contributions to the global development spaces are really around women's rights and gender equality. We have a long history of championing these issues, and we do so consistently in fora where other donors and other countries are not doing so. And so we have a multiplier effect in terms of our engagement in these spaces. Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy is truly I mean, it really is a model for other countries, and it actually has served our foreign policy as well, which is now starting to be called a feminist foreign policy. What it does is elevate the importance of gender analysis in all the decisions that we make. And so Canada is now not only in the way that it targets its money, but actually how we count it, the donor that provides the most funding to progressing gender equality indicators. We also have really uniquely focused on sort of force multiplying areas in that space as a country and as individual organizations around sexual reproductive health and rights. It's often an area that donors and organizations stay away from, but it's chronically underfunded. You know, sexual reproductive health is critical. Mothers being able to make the choices that they need to make to be able to plan for their families and do well is important, and yet donors stay away from this. And so Canada's a leading donor to sexual reproductive health and rights, and actually is a real catalyzer. And as we've seen, certainly under the Trump administration, the US withdraw fully from those spaces. Our leadership has been a shining light that has allowed other donors to continue to support in that space. You know, there's a lot to the dynamics of our international cooperation sector here. I think Canadians really do care a lot, and we have a very high number of organizations that work in this space, given the size of our population. So I think it speaks volumes to Canada's interest and interconnectedness across the globe and how multicultural we are. And I'd say that, you know, geographically, one of the places where we do, so the two areas where we have a predominant presence are Francophone West Africa and South American connections that are unique to certainly sort of European, actors in the international development space. I should say to all that we're a sector in tremendous ebullience and change, as are all. But really, this moment that we're living through now is accelerating questions of emphasizing how we work through partners, and that we really start to take apart what is a North-led model where organizations in the North make all decisions, have all the funding. We have to find ways to get to a place where agency really does rest with partners in other countries. And it's a challenge to us all. Even as we advocate for our country to do more, how do we make sure that it's not solely in our interest, that we are putting forward partners' interests first? There's a whole body of knowledge and conversation about that that we're working on. And we're being challenged by anti-racism efforts across our society that really raise big questions for our world that has been, in some respects, perpetuating inequalities and is really challenging us around access to power. We think about power often in political terms or, for the ultra rich, but actually power is true in all of our dynamics. And it's also true when you are an aid agency with a little bit of money for someone, you have power over them. And so we are really challenging ourselves as a sector across the globe. And now really, now that people have been able to travel, really, this is a chance to accelerate that process in important ways. Sorry, that was a bit of a sidetrack, but thanks for your question, Nicholas.
This, I guess, could be either an addendum or a bit of a follow-up, and I think we'll probably make this the last one. And the question is a two-parter, actually, part from Glenn and part from Malcolm, saying, is Canada's withdrawal from international involvement a uniquely Canadian failing, or is it part of a global mindset in Western societies? And do you believe that Western countries still believe that part of their role in the world is to advance democracy? Or is that the world as a whole would benefit if all our countries were democratic? There's a lot of that.
Yeah, there are a lot of, we could talk about this for the next 3 hours. Look, I do think that actually we have been witnessing for a few decades a democratic withdrawal. I think we have not been really championing human rights and democracy in ways that could be constructive as we would like to see. And so democracies have turned inwards. I think partly we've gotten complacent. Our lives have gotten a lot better in Western democracies. Our focuses have turned inwards, and our politics are imperfect, and that's part of it. I think our lives have gotten more comfortable, and our connections to these kinds of global projects and global building have really suffered as a result. There is, I do believe, an awakening that's happening, whether it's the Biden administration saying they want to hold a conference of democracies to start talking about how democracies can band together to, make sure that we defend democracy around the world. I do think it is the right thing for us to do. And there's a lot of, this is where I think we are all challenged, that actually the big global projects that existed in the post-war period, we have benefited from, and we've not had to reinvest in them heavily. Us as a country, we've benefited tremendously from the leadership of the US on these issues and on security and on diplomacy, and we have been able to underinvest in these spaces. We've been able to underinvest, and now we're starting to see what the price of that is, in our inability to influence China on the two Michaels, in our inability to get a seat on the Security Council for the second time. So we haven't been on the Security Council in 20 years. We don't have the influence that we thought we did because we haven't been investing in these spaces. And I am challenged because to me, democracy itself is not the sole objective. I mean, democracy is messy, but it's also underpinned by human rights. And human rights are things that we as Canadians believe in strongly. Are we willing to see the world backslide where authoritarian regimes will have the wind in their sails? I would argue that they already do. And so we have to ask ourselves these tough questions. Canada benefits from a world order where there's a rule-based world order where trade functions by certain rules, where it's not just the law of the strongest. And I think we would all argue that's the world we want, but are we willing to put our investments there to make sure that it's possible? And that's, I think, the big question of today. Will we have some version of a Marshall Plan globally to get out of this COVID crisis and actually make sure that we are on the right track? We've not been addressing inequalities the way that we should. And so is our withdrawal unique? No, I'd argue not. I think that we've seen versions of it in most democracies, the US being a glaring example just to the south of us. But we're seeing a desire to re-engage, and I think an awakening that's happening. But maybe you and your networks can also be having these conversations, and that's, I think, what's necessary for us to see if we can motivate all of ourselves to be part of the solutions globally.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Much appreciated. I'm going to turn it over now to our thanker emeritus, David Franklin, if you would be kind enough to extend our gratitude.
Nick, can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, David.
Nicholas, your presentation was very timely because in Rotary, February 23rd is our anniversary. And February is also the month when we focus on promoting international peace. Contributing to peace and international understanding has always been a priority of Rotary. We often ask ourselves as Rotarians, how can we get involved in promoting peace internationally? Supporting your organization, which meets this challenge, is one of a meaningful way that we can get involved. Thank you for your very articulate presentation, and we wish not only your organization good luck, but success, because if you succeed, the world succeeds too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words and for the invitation. It was really a pleasure to be able to spend some of this time with you.
And here's your score this week, David.
9. 10 or 10.
It's a tradition.